Some stories begin in the most ordinary moments. A routine day, a simple errand, a familiar place. But sometimes, those moments reveal the deepest parts of who we are. That's exactly what happened one afternoon inside a bustling bank branch. The place was packed. Long lines stretched across the lobby, the air filled with the impatient murmurs of customers checking their watches, sighing under their breath. Employees rushed from one counter to another, barely keeping up with the chaos. And in the middle of it all stood Maggie Thompson. An elderly woman, small in stature but carrying the quiet resilience of someone who had seen her fair share of struggles. She clutched an envelope tightly in her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. To everyone else, she might have just been another customer waiting her turn. But to Maggie, this wasn't just another day. This envelope held something far more important than numbers on a page. For her, this was about survival. Maggie had come looking for answers. What seemed like a simple banking error to some was, for her, a matter of survival. She wasn't here over a minor inconvenience. She needed to understand what had happened to her money. Taking a steadying breath, she stepped forward toward one of the service counters. She adjusted her coat, lifting her chin slightly, trying to appear confident. But the way she clutched that envelope, the worry flickering in her eyes, gave her away. "I hope they can sort this out today," she murmured under her breath, glancing down at the papers once more. But Maggie wasn't just going to face bureaucracy that day. She was about to face something far worse. Across the lobby, Todd Murphy, one of the bank employees, surveyed the room. He wasn't just scanning for customers. He was deciding who was worth his time. His eyes flicked from one person to the next, and without saying a word, he made his judgments. To Todd, some customers mattered more than others, and Maggie Thompson, with her worn coat and her trembling hands, was not one of them. Todd Murphy barely needed a second to make up his mind. Without a word, he prioritized the customers who looked like they had bigger bank accounts, the ones dressed in tailored suits or expensive shoes. To him, those were the people worth his time. And Maggie Thompson? With her worn-out envelope and quiet demeanor, she didn't even register on his radar. Maggie hesitated for a moment, glancing around as if looking for reassurance. The nervous energy in her hands, the way she clutched that envelope, hinted at a deeper fear, one she was trying her best to push down. Finally, she stepped forward. She approached the counter, pausing just long enough to take a deep breath, as if she already knew this wouldn't be easy. She didn't know it yet, but this wasn't going to be just another frustrating visit to the bank. This afternoon would become one of the most humiliating moments of her life. But what Maggie didn't know was that the unexpected was already on its way. She reached the service counter, where a young teller, Brittany Parker, sat behind the desk. Brittany barely looked up. Her fingers clacked against the keyboard, her expression tired and impatient, as if she had already decided this conversation would be a waste of time. "Good afternoon, ma'am. How can I help you?" she asked, her eyes still glued to the screen. Maggie adjusted the envelope in her hands, her fingers gripping it a little tighter. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Good afternoon," she said politely. "I'm here because my account has some charges that I believe are incorrect. I brought everything I could to try to understand." Brittany finally looked up, but there was no concern in her eyes, no patience, just indifference. Brittany's gaze remained cold, indifferent. She grabbed the envelope mechanically, flipping through the papers with as little effort as possible, like she was barely skimming them. "Let's see. Ah, here it is," she said flatly. "These charges are standard, ma'am. They're all listed in your account agreement." Without another word, she shoved the envelope back toward Maggie. Maggie blinked, feeling her stomach tighten. Something about the way Brittany dismissed her, so casual, so detached, made her feel smaller. She swallowed, her voice softer now. "But I can't afford these fees. This has to be a mistake. I was never informed about these charges." Brittany let out a loud, exaggerated sigh and rolled her eyes. A few customers nearby glanced over, their curiosity piqued by the visible irritation in Brittany's tone. Then, with a smirk, Brittany spoke again, this time louder, sharper, designed to cut. "Ma'am, maybe you don't understand how things work these days." Brittany's voice took on a sharp, condescending edge. "Banks have policies, ma'am, and these fees are automatic. There's nothing I can do." She didn't even try to sound apologetic. Maggie felt something tighten in her chest. It wasn't just the words, it was the way they were said. Cold, dismissive. As if her problem wasn't even worth acknowledging. As if she wasn't worth acknowledging. Her fingers trembled slightly around the envelope as she tried to hold back the sting of humiliation. She took a small breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just want what's fair." Brittany crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly, a smirk tugging at her lips, as if she had all the power in this moment. "Fair?" she repeated mockingly. Then, with a slow shrug, she added, just loud enough for others to hear, "If you want to avoid fees, ma'am, you need to keep more money in your account. That's how it works." Maggie felt the heat of embarrassment creeping up her neck. The whispers started. A few customers exchanged glances, some shaking their heads, others watching the scene unfold like a spectacle. The public humiliation had begun. The whispers grew. Maggie could feel the weight of their stares, some curious, some indifferent, some judgmental. She wasn't just a woman at the counter anymore. She was a spectacle. But still, she fought to keep her composure. Her voice, though trembling, carried quiet determination. "It can't be like this. I just want to understand what happened." She wasn't demanding anything outrageous. She wasn't asking for special treatment. She just wanted answers. But instead of help, Maggie was about to face something far worse. Because Todd Murphy, the bank manager himself, had been watching, and he was already walking toward the counter. His steps were deliberate, firm. The moment he approached, Brittany immediately straightened her posture, her smirk fading into something more serious. Todd's presence commanded attention. But what he didn't know was that someone else had been watching too. And soon, this wasn't going to be just another case of corporate indifference. This was about to become a reckoning. Brittany, sensing Todd's presence beside her, immediately adjusted her posture, trying to appear more professional, more efficient. Todd crossed his arms, his expression unreadable as he glanced briefly at Maggie before shifting his full attention to Brittany. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Brittany forced a nervous smile. She knew how to play the game. "No, sir. Just a customer having trouble understanding the account policies." Maggie's stomach dropped. That wasn't the truth. She wasn't confused. She had been dismissed, belittled, made to feel small. She opened her mouth, trying to correct the narrative. "That's not it," she said, her voice carrying a wavering strength. "I believe there's been a mistake with my account. I'm just trying to get it resolved." But she didn't even get to finish. Todd raised his hand, cutting her off as if she weren't worth the time it took to listen. "Ma'am," he said, his tone cold, final. "If you think there's been a mistake, you should have read the contract before opening your account." It wasn't just a dismissal, it was a verdict. And in that moment, Maggie realized they were never going to help her. Todd didn't stop there. "Everything is very clear for those who pay attention," he added, his words sharp, dismissive. Maggie stood there, stunned by his harsh tone. For a brief moment, she said nothing, trying to process the coldness of it all. But then, with a steadying breath, she found her voice. "I've always kept my account in good standing," she said, determined to hold her ground. "These charges appeared out of nowhere. All I'm asking is for someone to review them." Todd let out a short, almost mocking laugh. "Review?" he scoffed, shaking his head. "Ma'am, what's in the system is in the system. We don't review something that's automatic." Maggie felt the humiliation deepen. It wasn't just what he was saying, it was how he was saying it, like she was wasting his time, like she was nothing. In that moment, Maggie felt invisible. She glanced around, searching for a friendly face, a single sign of support. But all she found was indifference. Some customers avoided her gaze altogether, pretending not to notice. Others whispered quietly among themselves, unwilling to step in. She was alone. Todd, sensing his control over the situation, leaned slightly over the counter, his voice dropping just enough to make it more cutting. "If you can't afford the fees," he said, his tone dripping with condescension, "maybe this bank isn't the right place for you." Maggie opened her mouth, wanting, needing to respond. But nothing came out. The indignation, the shame, the sheer weight of the moment made it hard to form words. Instead, she looked down at the envelope in her hands, her fingers gripping the worn edges as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Todd straightened, already turning away. To him, this conversation was over. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that it was far from over. Because in that very moment, someone unexpected was watching. To Todd, Maggie was nothing more than an inconvenience, a problem to dismiss, a moment to forget. But fate had other plans. Across the bank, seated quietly near the waiting area, a discreet figure had been watching everything. A man in a casual jacket and a baseball cap blending into the crowd. He hadn't spoken, hadn't moved, until now. When he heard Todd's words, something in him shifted. And then he stood. With slow, deliberate steps, he approached the counter, not drawing immediate attention. Not yet. But then, his voice. Calm. Steady. Unshakable. "Why are you speaking to her like that?" The entire bank froze, the background noise of murmuring customers, tapping keyboards, and rustling papers, gone. Every head turned toward the man who had just spoken. At first glance, he seemed like just another customer. Ordinary, unassuming. But there was something in the way he stood, the way his voice carried through the air, a presence that couldn't be ignored. And in just a few seconds, the entire energy of the room had changed. At first, he seemed ordinary, just another customer in line, just another face in the crowd. But within seconds, everyone realized he was anything but. The atmosphere in the bank shifted. The silence wasn't just from curiosity anymore. It was from recognition. Something about the way he stood, the way his voice had cut through the room with quiet authority, made people pay attention. Maggie turned, her eyes widening in shock and disbelief. Todd Murphy, on the other hand, was anything but impressed. Annoyed by the interruption, he turned slowly, clearly irritated. His arms crossed over his chest, his stance one of forced authority. And then, with a sneer, he demanded, "And who are you to question me?" But before the words even fully left his mouth, a murmur began to spread through the bank. Because now, customers weren't just watching, they were recognizing him. Todd crossed his arms tighter, furrowing his brow. "What's happening here?" he asked, his irritation growing. Instead, he took a few slow, deliberate steps forward. Then, he reached up and removed his cap. And that's when the murmurs started. Soft at first, then growing louder, spreading like wildfire as realization dawned across the room. Keanu Reeves. Yes, him. The world-famous actor, known for his kindness, humility, and quiet strength, was standing right there. And now, everyone in the bank knew it. Brittany's face paled. Customers leaned in, whispering frantically. Even Todd, who had been so sure of his authority just seconds ago, shifted uneasily. But Keanu? Keanu remained calm, unshaken, unmoved. His gaze stayed locked on Todd, his voice steady, controlled, but carrying an unmistakable weight. "It doesn't matter who I am," he said, his tone cutting through the tension like a knife. "What matters is why you're treating this lady like this." Maggie turned to look at him, her breath catching in her throat. She had never imagined someone, let alone Keanu Reeves, would step in for her. But right now, That's exactly what he was doing. Maggie stared at Keanu, her mind struggling to process what was happening. Of all the people in the world, Keanu Reeves was standing beside her, defending her. Meanwhile, Todd forced himself to take a deep breath, trying to regain control of the situation. His confidence had been shaken, but he wasn't about to back down. "Mr. Reeves, I had no idea you were here," he said, his voice stiff, masking his unease. "But look, this is none of your business. We have policies at this bank, and this lady isn't meeting the requirements." Keanu let out a quiet, ironic chuckle, tilting his head slightly as he studied Todd. "Policies?" he repeated. Then his voice dropped slightly, not in volume but in intensity. "Or just an excuse to humiliate someone who's trying to solve a problem?" The bank went dead silent. Keanu's presence was magnetic, undeniable. Even Brittany, who just minutes ago had been so sure of herself, so confident in dismissing Maggie, shifted uncomfortably, casting a nervous glance at Todd. Because at that moment, everyone in the room knew the truth. This wasn't about policies. This was about power. And Keanu Reeves? He wasn't going to let them get away with it. Brittany shifted nervously, her confidence crumbling. She turned to Todd, silently begging him to say something, anything, to justify what was happening. But there was no justification. Keanu, still calm but now carrying an undeniable authority, turned to Maggie. His voice softened. "Ma'am, what exactly is the problem? Can you show me what's going on?" Maggie hesitated. For a moment it felt unreal, like she was caught in some kind of dream. But Keanu's gaze was steady, reassuring. So slowly she handed him the envelope. Keanu took it with care, unfolding the papers and scanning them in silence. The entire bank seemed to hold its breath. Then, after just a few seconds, he looked up. And when he spoke, his words were clear, absolute. "This is a mistake." Todd stiffened. "These charges shouldn't be here," Keanu continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're going to fix this, right now." Todd opened his mouth to argue, but before he could get a word out, Keanu raised his hand, silencing him instantly. His expression was calm, but his presence filled the room. "If this is a mistake," Keanu said, his voice low, firm, "you'll fix it." Then, his gaze hardened. "And if it's not, it's going to be much worse for you." The entire bank was in shock. No one had expected Keanu Reeves, one of the most recognizable figures in the world, to step in so directly, so fearlessly. But he wasn't done yet. With deliberate movement, he placed the envelope on the counter, his gaze locked onto Todd with unwavering intensity. "I want you to review this immediately," Keanu said, his voice measured but firm. "And I'm not leaving until everything is resolved." Todd's mouth opened, then closed. He was speechless, caught completely off guard. But what Todd didn't realize, what no one realized, was that Keanu was already putting the pieces together. Because this wasn't just a simple banking mistake. It was about to become something much bigger. Todd Murphy, now visibly uncomfortable, adjusted his collar, sweat forming at his brow. And in that moment, he knew. There was no way out. Todd swallowed hard, adjusting the collar of his shirt, his discomfort growing by the second. He shot a tense glance at Brittany, as if silently asking for backup. But Brittany looked just as lost as he did. Unsure, unsteady. She had been so confident just moments ago, dismissing Maggie without a second thought. Now she was standing in front of Keanu Reeves, exposed. But Keanu wasn't going to wait. He leaned slightly over the counter, his posture still calm, collected, but commanding. His voice carried no anger, no raised volume, just undeniable authority. "We're not just talking about a simple mistake here, are we?" The question hung in the air, heavy. "We're talking about how you're treating a customer who deserves respect. And from what I've seen, that's clearly lacking here." The weight of his words sank in. Brittany, still struggling to grasp control of the situation, finally spoke. But her voice, so sharp and dismissive before, now trembled slightly. "Mr. Reeves, maybe you don't understand how the system works. We follow strict—" Keanu raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. Not aggressively, not even forcefully. Just enough. Enough to remind them. He wasn't buying it. Keanu raised his hand again, cutting Brittany off, not aggressively, but with firm finality. "Strict guidelines," he repeated, tilting his head slightly. Then, with the calm, unshakable confidence that made the entire room hang onto his every word, he continued. "I understand enough to know these fees are completely arbitrary, and I also know you have the autonomy to correct them." Brittany froze. Because he was right. They could fix this. They just didn't want to. Maggie, still standing beside him, clasped her hands together, her fingers twisting slightly. Even now, she couldn't quite believe what was happening. Keanu turned to her, his expression softening. He offered a reassuring smile. "Don't worry," he said gently. "We're going to sort this out." Maggie swallowed hard, nodding. But around them? The entire bank was silent. Not a whisper, not a murmur. Customers, employees, everyone had stopped what they were doing because they knew something big was happening. And now, they were all waiting to see how this would end. Keanu took the envelope back, holding it up for everyone to see. With measured movements, he pulled out the statements, his gaze locked on Todd. "These statements," he said, flipping through the pages. "The charges started 2 months ago, correct?" He turned to Maggie, his voice softer. She nodded. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Keanu nodded back, then slowly turned his attention to Todd once more. And this time, his words cut through the silence like a blade. "Tell me, Todd, why did these maintenance fees suddenly triple?" His voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. "Because from where I'm standing, it doesn't look like there's any legitimate reason here." Todd opened his mouth, but before he could fumble out an excuse, Keanu raised a hand again, silencing him. Only this time, the weight behind it was even heavier. "You might want to think carefully about your answer," Keanu warned, his voice low, deliberate. He took a step closer, closing the space between them. "Because if this is something bigger than a mistake, you and everyone involved are about to have a much bigger problem on your hands." The air in the bank grew thick with tension, and for the first time, Todd looked genuinely afraid. The tension in the bank was palpable. The employees who had once seemed indifferent, detached, now looked visibly nervous, because this wasn't just a customer complaint anymore. This was a reckoning. Todd knew it. He felt it. There was no charming his way out of this, no corporate excuse that would work. His throat went dry as he swallowed hard, stepping back. I'll need to review this in the system," he stammered, his voice no longer carrying the same arrogance from before. Keanu crossed his arms, his gaze never wavering. "Then start. Now." The words hit like a command. Maggie, still standing beside Keanu, watched in stunned silence as Todd nearly tripped over himself rushing to the computer. He sat down, fingers flying across the keyboard, his panic growing with every passing second. Brittany, once so smug and dismissive, hovered beside him, her confidence shattered. She tried to keep up, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. As Todd scanned the records, his expression began to change. Because the deeper he looked, the worse it got. Keanu remained steadfast by Maggie's side, his presence unshaken, immovable. What had started as a simple banking dispute was now turning into something far more serious. Todd's fingers froze over the keyboard. His face, once full of smug authority, was now pale, glistening with sweat. Slowly, he stood from his chair. "Mr. Reeves, there's something wrong here," he muttered, his voice hesitant, uneasy. Keanu leaned in slightly, his piercing gaze never leaving Todd's face. "Wrong how?" Todd hesitated, glancing at Maggie, then back at Keanu. Finally, his shoulders sagged in defeat. It looks like these charges were applied to multiple accounts, mostly belonging to elderly customers. The room grew even quieter. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Employees exchanged nervous glances. Customers murmured in disbelief. Keanu, still calm, still composed, slowly shook his head. Then, his voice dropped to a deadly quiet. That's not a mistake. His gaze hardened. That's a scheme. Maggie wasn't the only victim, and Keanu knew it. This wasn't just about one woman's account. This was about something far bigger, something calculated. He had come here expecting to help one person. But now he was about to expose a full-scale scheme targeting the most vulnerable customers. And Todd knew it too. He was in full panic mode, his eyes darting around, searching for a way out. But there was none. The truth had already been spoken. The bank was silent, watching, waiting. Todd Murphy, the man who had been so dismissive, so arrogant, was now visibly shaken. His fingers fidgeted nervously with his tie, his posture shifting uneasily. He looked at Keanu, desperate to regain control, but Keanu didn't move, didn't blink, didn't break eye contact. He stood firm, a wall of quiet authority. Todd licked his lips, his voice unsteady, trembling. "Mr. Reeves, I swear, this was a system error," he stammered. "It's not something we did on—" Keanu's expression didn't change. And in that moment, Todd realized there was no talking his way out of this. Keanu's expression hardened. His eyes narrowed. His arms crossed over his chest. A silent challenge. "A system error?" he repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. "How convenient." Then his words cut deeper. "Tell me, Todd, why do these errors only affect elderly accounts?" The bank fell even quieter. Customers leaned in, employees stiffened, and the weight of the moment pressed down on everyone in the room. "Did you really think we wouldn't notice?" Keanu added, his gaze locked on Todd. For the first time, Todd had no words. Maggie, who had spent the entire ordeal feeling powerless, felt something shift inside her. Her voice, though still trembling, carried a new strength. "So I'm not the only one," she asked, turning toward Todd. "How many people have you cheated?" Her question hung in the air, unanswered. Because everyone could see it. Todd had nothing to say. He tried. His mouth opened, then closed. His hands twitched at his sides. He was unraveling. Brittany, standing beside him, looked even more nervous now. Because she knew this was bigger than a few fees, and it was all about to come crashing down. Todd's voice was barely steady now. I'll investigate this. I need more time to figure it out." Keanu stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. Then, he placed his hands firmly on the counter, his presence undeniable, unshakable. "You've had enough time." His voice was low but commanding. It wasn't a request. "Now you're going to tell the truth." Todd's breath hitched. He was trapped, nowhere left to turn. Keanu's gaze never wavered. "How many people have been affected by this?" Todd swallowed hard, his face glistening with sweat. He hesitated, then cast a quick, desperate glance at Brittany. But she did the one thing he feared most. She looked away. She wouldn't save him. No one would. Finally, Todd's shoulders sagged. His voice came out small, broken. I'm not sure," he admitted. "Maybe hundreds." The words landed like a bombshell. A few customers gasped. Others exchanged looks of horror and disbelief. This wasn't just about Maggie. This was about countless victims. Keanu knew what had to happen next. Without hesitation, he pulled out his phone. Keanu didn't hesitate. With one swift motion, he raised his phone and hit record. The camera focused on Todd, his face dripping with sweat, panic settling into his features. Keanu's voice was calm, steady, but unyielding. "What you're hearing right now," he said, looking straight into the lens, "is a bank manager admitting that his bank has been charging elderly customers unjust fees. just to boost profits. He slowly turned the camera toward Brittany, her face pale, her confidence completely gone. "This is unacceptable," Keanu continued, his voice growing heavier with purpose. "And we're going to make sure everyone knows what's happening here." Todd's eyes widened in terror. His hands shot up in desperation. "Wait! Please, don't do that," he stammered. "We can fix this. I can fix it right now." Keanu didn't flinch. He lowered the phone slightly, but his expression remained firm, unshaken. "Fix it?" he repeated, his tone razor-sharp. Then, he leaned in just slightly. "This isn't just about returning the money, Todd." His next words hit like a hammer. "This is about justice." He tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "Do you really think an apology is going to be enough?" Todd's breathing was shaky. His forehead glistened with sweat. His voice, once so firm and dismissive, now barely held together. What do you want from me?" he asked, his tone almost pleading. Keanu didn't hesitate. He leaned in slightly, his gaze locked onto Todd's, unflinching. "I want you to make this right." Todd swallowed hard. "For every single person who was affected." Keanu's voice didn't waver. "And I want the authorities to know exactly what happened here." The weight of those words sank in. Todd's entire demeanor collapsed. His shoulders slumped, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. But there was none. He exhaled shakily, then nodded, defeated. Because now, he knew. There was no way out. Keanu didn't move, didn't relax. He stood firm. He hadn't just stepped in for Maggie. He had stepped in for every person who had been wronged. And he was going to make sure justice was served. Hours later, the fallout began. The bank released an official statement announcing radical changes. Todd and Brittany, removed, fired, erased. But Keanu, he wasn't done yet, because this wasn't just about one corrupt bank. This was a movement. Todd and Brittany weren't just fired. They were completely removed from their positions, disgraced, exposed. And it didn't stop there. The bank was forced to launch a full audit, digging through every account affected by the unjust fees. What had started as one woman's quiet struggle had now become a sweeping investigation. And Maggie? She got more than just an apology. She was fully reimbursed for all the money that had been unfairly taken from her. But it didn't end there. She also received additional compensation for the hardship she had endured. A visibly embarrassed bank representative stood before her, wringing his hands as he delivered the words Todd Murphy never would. "Mrs. Thompson, on behalf of the bank, we sincerely apologize for this terrible situation. We are committed to correcting this immediately." Maggie stood there, stunned. She had fought. She had stood her ground. And now she was heard. Her eyes welled with tears as she turned to Keanu, her voice thick with emotion. "I never could have done this without you." Maggie's voice quivered, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Thank you for believing in me." Keanu's expression softened. A small, reassuring smile touched his lips as he shook his head slightly. "You should never have had to go through this," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. Then, he glanced around the room, at the stunned customers, at the employees who had once ignored Maggie. "But now it's not just about you." He looked back at her, his tone resolute. "We're helping so many others who were wronged, too." Maggie exhaled, her shoulders just a little lighter. As she stepped out of the bank, something had changed. She was still humble, still herself, but there was now a renewed spark of hope in her eyes. Keanu stood beside her for a moment, taking in the silent crowd that had just witnessed everything. Some looked ashamed, others moved, but all of them changed. Keanu turned toward them, his voice steady, his message crystal clear. "Never let anyone tell you that you're worth less." His eyes scanned the crowd, landing on faces both young and old. Whether you're elderly, struggling, or just trying to get by, Keanu's voice carried through the room, steady and unwavering. Young, wealthy, or struggling, everyone deserves respect. His eyes swept across the faces in the crowd. And most importantly, never be afraid to fight for what's right. The weight of his words settled over the room. Then, applause. It started small. A single clap, then another, then a wave. Customers who had once stood silent, indifferent, now clapped, nodded, some even cheering. Keanu turned to Maggie, offering her a small, knowing smile. Then, with a discreet wave, he stepped toward the doors. And just like that, he was gone. But the impact of what had just happened, that would never leave. A few days later, the video surfaced. Keanu Reeves standing in a bank, exposing corruption with calm, relentless determination. It exploded online. Millions of views, thousands of comments. People weren't just watching, they were outraged, inspired, moved. The bank? It faced a full-scale investigation, and most importantly, victims began recovering their lost savings. Because this wasn't just about Maggie. It was about every person who had been wronged and every person who had ever been told their voice didn't matter. And thanks to one moment of courage, the world was reminded of a simple truth. Justice always finds a way. Maggie's story became more than just a call for justice. It became a symbol of hope, a reminder that one voice, one stand, one act of courage can create a ripple effect that changes everything. Because respect, it shouldn't be a privilege. And justice? It shouldn't have to be fought for. It should be the rule we all live by. May this story inspire you to act with courage and empathy wherever you are. If this story moved you, share it. Let more people feel inspired. And comment below. Respect is for everyone. Because together we can create a world where justice isn't a fight, it's a given.